I always like to begin with this slide because a lot of folks spend less time thinking about circadian rhythms than I do. So I want to emphasize really the pervasiveness of circadian rhythms. So these are rhythms that are about 24 hours in length, and they exist in many, if not most, physiological, behavioral, and psychological processes. And the purpose of them is to organize all these processes for optimal interaction with the environment. So both the outside world and also for optimal interaction with time with respect to one another. Now I'm noticing, Carolina, it seems like the automatic rehearse timing setting is on, which I did not put on, so I'm not sure if we can do anything about it at this point. But I'll try to keep it to where I'm talking. So as you can see here from this slide, this is just the influence of circadian rhythms. And you'll notice both sleep and melatonin are listed there, and we'll be talking about those moving on. And again, the purpose is for optimal interaction with the environment, and indeed, as Anna Wirtz-Justice elegantly put, temporal order is essential. Now, the most important discovery in circadian science in the past 15 years or so is the identification of the molecular clock, shown here in a simplistic form, and that was recognized that last fall when the Nobel Prize Committee awarded an award to this U.S. trio that was involved in part of identifying that clock. And what we now know is that this molecular clock is in essentially every cell of the body, and so it's really more of a picture of where we have this orchestra of clocks that are all under the control or the influence of the central clock, shown here as the SCN in the brain. And the job of that central clock is to keep all these clocks in tune. And if they're not kept in tune, then problems arise. And that's a topic where we will come in. So with that background in mind, I'm going to go into a little more background specifically on adolescent sleep and circadian rhythms and their links to substance use. We'll talk about findings from the CADCA study, and then I'll talk about a little bit of what kind of mechanisms we think might be involved. So starting with the background. There's a host of changes that occur during adolescence and sleep. And in general, what we see is things seem to get worse. So the sleep continuity and so how continuous or fragmented sleep is and the quality of sleep tends to get worse. Sleep duration tends to get worse. Sleep duration tends to go down. Sleep timing tends to shift later, and daytime sleep to increase. And we're going to focus in on a couple aspects of that and exactly how that comes to pass and what the implications might be. So on how much sleep we do need to get, and this is really across the lifespan, but I'm focusing here on pediatric sleep for the moment. And in particular, what they've recommended is for adolescents that 8 to 10 hours. The question then is, how many teens are actually getting the recommended amount of sleep? And we have some data on that. So this is two different data sets. One is on the left is the 2006 Sleep in America poll that the National Sleep Foundation did. And what you can see is that in 6th to 8th grade, more than 2/3 of the youth are getting more than 8-hour recommendation. However, when we see this transition to senior high school, in the 9th to 12th grade, now about 2/3 of the teens are getting less than the recommended amount of sleep. That was in 2006. What do we see in 2013? Very similar numbers here on the right. And so this is the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Study, or Surveillance Survey, and again, less than 1/3 of girls and approximately 1/3 amount of sleep. Now, it's not just about how much sleep we're getting, it's also about the timing. And so here we see from the 2006 Sleep in America poll on the left, we can see how timing changes over the course of grade. So in the top, we see bedtimes, and both on weekdays and weekends, we see those progressively getting later. We see a similar pattern for the rise times on the weekends in the green dashed line below, also getting later, but we see pretty flat trajectory for the bedtimes on the weekdays, a pretty flat trajectory for the bedtimes on the weekdays. And there we see that first influence of school start times. So school start times constrain the timing. So even though there's this tendency and this push to have later sleep, start times don't push or don't allow that or don't accommodate that. And sleep timing changes happening. Is it just socially driven or are there biological changes? And there's a lot of evidence that there are biological changes that are underlying this. One of these is when we look at self-reported what's called chronotype, and we look over the lifespan, we see this very consistent change here on the right, where from age 10 to 20, you see this dramatic shift later in their sleep timing, or their preferred sleep timing. And then there's this inflection point in the early 20s, and then this long, slow shift towards preferring earlier times for the rest of the lifespan, and eventually towards preferring earlier times for the rest of the lifespan, and eventually early bird dinners for our older adult friends. And so what's really notable again about this is this dramatic shift later that occurs during the teens that really is lasting into the early 20s. So that's self-report, but we've also can look at this biologically. And so the main way we do that in humans is by using melatonin. And specifically, we look at the secretion pattern of melatonin with relation to the clock and with relation to during what we call biological night. And what we can do is we can measure when that secretion begins. It's called the dim light melatonin onset, and it's called that because we have to actually collect melatonin under dim light conditions because it's suppressed by light. And so as we can see here, the dim light melatonin onset occurs about 2 hours before. So with keeping that in mind, we show the dim light melatonin onset, or DILMO, here. And on the left, we see some cross-sectional data showing in 2 different age groups what's happening. Move this back here. Move this back here. Over school and summer, and so you can see both age groups. Summer DILMOs are later. So again, when they don't have the constraint of school start times, their internal clock shifts later. And then we can see as they get older, there's also a consistent shift later. So at both time points, both school or summer, the teenagers have later internal clock time. That's cross-sectional data. There's some limited longitudinal data for Stephanie Crowley's group, again showing that same effect here in both the younger and the older cohorts as they're get later in terms of their internal clock. And it seems to begin about with puberty. So how does this fit with school start times? So, and I'm really sorry about these slides. I don't know. I wish there was a way to turn off the automatic advance, but turn off the automatic advance. But so again, as we've identified, post-puberty, both the internal clock and preferred sleep timing tends to shift later. So they shift towards what we call an evening chronotype, and does not match well with early school start times. So if we see preferred sleep week timing here in the red, something like midnight to 9:30 is what we've seen in large data sets. During the school week, they're trying to accommodate that earlier schedule, trying to go to bed early but having difficulty falling asleep, so resulting in insomnia earlier than they'd prefer. Start curtailing their sleep out and resulting in sleep loss. And then the final part of it is that they have to be awake during this period of time, again, where their brain would rather them be asleep. And so we call that circadian misalignment. Then on the weekend, they're able to be sleeping extra long to make up for the sleep that they lost during the school week. But all things come to an end, or good things come to an end, and Sunday night rolls around, and they essentially have to travel back multiple time zones to start school on Monday morning. And that bouncing back and forth between the weekend time zone, and the school week time zone has been termed social jet lag. So how does this all relate to substance use? Well, we've got a wealth of data showing cross-sectional associations. So we know when people are sleeping worse, or where they have later sleep timing, all that tends to be associated with worse substance use. But that doesn't tell us which comes first. And so what's been notable in the past 10 to 15 years is that there's been increasing publication of longitudinal data sets showing these links. And so across, like insomnia, a loss of sleep based on short sleep duration or daytime sleepiness, and more of these so-called circadian characteristics, or having later timing, or more of, again, related to social jet lag, these delays in sleep timing over the weekend, or more variable sleep timing. All three categories have been linked in turn to use and problems with alcohol, use and problems with marijuana and other street drugs, and nicotine and tobacco use. Now, most of these studies have tended to focus on single items or very restricted lists of sleep problems, and they tend to overlook more of these timing issues. So one of the main things we wanted to do in the Eveningness study was to have a really contrast and compare the different sleep characteristics that may be related to substance use, and to make sure that we are including measurement of more of these timing variables. So the paper is published in ACER. This is again data based from the Eveningness study, which is this 5-site study of adolescent brain development and substance use. It's a longitudinal study that uses a accelerated longitudinal design. We're now beginning our second 5 years, so eventually we'll have a good 10 years to look at. At baseline, recruited 831 participants, aged 12 to 21.9. And in the present sample, we focused on 729 participants. And I should note, and this is important, that the sample was recruited to have a heavy emphasis because they wanted to make sure, looking at the brain stuff, that there wasn't the influence of prior substance use in the majority of the sample. So in terms of the sleep measures, so again, we wanted to be comprehensive and capture a lot of different kinds of sleep characteristics. A very heavy assessment battery. So instead of using the full measures across the whole study, all the sites, we pulled items from the various measures and created this 10-item sleep measure that all the sites would administer. And so we looked at sleep timing on weekdays and weekends. We looked at sleep quality based on the item from the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. We looked at their daytime sleepiness from the Cleveland Adolescent Sleepiness Questionnaire. And we looked at their chronotype or circadian preference based on the composite scale of morningness. And again, just circadian preference based on the composite scale of morningness. And again, just pulling items from these measures, but at the Pittsburgh site and the SRI site, we did the full measures and found that these abbreviated measures correlated very strongly with the full measures. So we can be confident that we're getting a good assessment of these various characteristics. The main measure in the study was the customary drinking and drug use record. And we looked at 3 different substance characteristics. So one, at-risk alcohol use based on the NIAAA Alcohol Screen and Brief Intervention Guide. And we created 3 categories of risk, the high risk, moderate risk, and low risk, based on the frequency of use. We also created a binge alcohol use measure, and this was here we used age-specific thresholds to define binges, and this was based on work done here in Pittsburgh on John Donovan, where using estimated blood alcohol concentrations came up with more age-appropriate binge levels. And so you can see those listed there, and then we created both heavy and extreme binge level threshold. And then finally, we wanted to look at marijuana use as well. It was so highly skewed, especially in the first year in terms of use, that we basically just turned this into a yes/no. Are they using or not? Okay, so I'll just go through the analytic approach really quickly. So, use ordinal regression and logistic regression to look at how our sleep variables, baseline sleep variables, were related to substance use variables, all done in SAS. Made sure we satisfied the appropriate assumptions, controlled for multiple comparisons since there was a lot, controlled for multiple comparisons since there was a lot of them, and then we covaried for plausible covariates, so age, sex, race, and parental SES. And then when we were looking longitudinally, we also controlled for baseline substance use. And then finally, a reviewer at the journal suggested we always that may be accounting for what's going on, and so we did a secondary analysis using the internalizing and externalizing scales from the Achenbach to see if that accounted for the effects. So here are the demographics of our sample. We evenly split between females and males, and nice representation. Both in terms of race and ethnicity, and internalizing and externalizing. On the healthy side, again, hard to interpret these substance use variables, so probably easier to look at in terms of prevalence. And I noticed that during conversion, we lost the titles of these figures, but basically we have at-risk alcohol use on the left, binge alcohol use in the middle, and marijuana use on the right. And you can see again at middle and marijuana use on the right, and you can see again at baseline that the vast majority, about 85% of the participants, are in the no risk, no binging, and no alcohol and no marijuana use categories. We do see some movement on that at the 1-year follow-up, so we see increased risky alcohol use and binging and an increasing use of marijuana use. Now, this is again important in thinking about the results because a relatively small proportion of this sample is engaging in this risky use and marijuana use, and so we're anticipating as we look at later years and more of the sample has started to engage, we find a stronger signal between sleep and substance use moving on. In terms of sleep characteristics, animation's not working very well here again, but basically, so there again, the overarching message is a pretty healthy sample at baseline. So the sleep quality index, higher numbers are worse. So they're on the averages on the healthy side. In terms of circadian preference, averages on the eveningness side, as we would expect with adolescence. Hard to interpret. The timing measures are perhaps more interpretable. So on weekday sleep, we see them going to bed on average around 10:30, getting up about 6:45, and actually meeting what the recommendations would be. So on average, getting about 8.2 hours of sleep, although you see there's quite a range there from 4 to 13.5, and getting considerably more sleep as well. And then we looked again at what weekday-weekend delays, that social jet lag effect, and we see that they're staying up later, about an hour and a third, 0.3 hours, and then sleeping in almost 3 hours later than they were on the weekdays. Hypothesis was essentially that worse sleep in any category was going to lead to, or be associated with, or lead to more at-risk alcohol use, binge alcohol use, and marijuana use. And for the most part, we had prior literature showing these effects in all this direction. So getting into the actual tables then, and this advancing is going to drive me crazy, so I'll try to walk you through these busy slides. So essentially, at the top, we've got at-risk alcohol use at baseline, at the bottom, binge use at baseline, at the bottom, binge alcohol use at baseline, with all our sleep variables. And what we can see is a pretty consistent story where the sleep timing variables are the ones that are most consistently linked to the substance use variables. So we see greater eveningness in terms of circadian preference were significantly associated with more at-risk alcohol use at baseline and more binge alcohol use at baseline. We also see effects for sleep quality in both, where worse sleep quality is associated with more at-risk alcohol use and more binge alcohol use. When we control for internalizing and externalizing, some of those effects go away, but they all, when we control for those multiple comparisons, suggesting that part of the story might be that effects of sleep on internalizing and or externalizing, and that may be part of the link. With the substance use, but it doesn't seem to be the story in all cases. In terms of marijuana use then, again, similar story where, again, greater eveningness or later sleep timing that they were using marijuana at baseline. And controlling for internalizing and externalizing reduced that association. Okay, so that's just, again, cross-sectional. So the more interesting story then is what do we see? So the more interesting story then is what do we see when we look longitudinally and animation done. So no effects on at-risk alcohol use, but we do see, again, that consistent story with binge alcohol use. So greater eveningness and later sleep timing on bedtimes, both weekdays and weekends, were associated with more likely to be in a higher category of binge alcohol use a year later. Now, interestingly, we also see duration popping up here. And what I thought was particular as being what we consider sleep need in this group, it's interesting to notice that only those in the category of no binge alcohol use a year later are getting the required amount of sleep. And all those in the categories, higher binge categories, at baseline were getting insufficient sleep based on that measure. So again, underscoring that maybe that 8-hour cutoff is an important cutoff to pay attention to. And again, in this case, most of the effects hold up after we control for internalizing and externalizing, so that doesn't seem to be the whole story of what's going on here. Interestingly, we don't see, the social jet lag effects here. So the weekend delays were not associated with at-risk alcohol use. So going on to marijuana then, again, exact same story in terms of greater eveningness, shorter weekday sleep duration, and longer weekend bedtime or later weekend bedtimes, all associated with more likely having used marijuana a year later. Here we also see sleep quality appear, so having lower sleep quality at baseline was more associated with a greater likelihood of having used marijuana a year later. And again, we see that sleep duration is shorter sleep duration was associated with more likely having used marijuana a year later. And again, we see that same seeming cutoff with the 8 hours, that if they were getting more than 8 hours at baseline, they hadn't used marijuana a year later. If they were getting less than 8 hours at baseline, they had. And then some of these effects held up after controlling for internalizing and externalizing, not all of them. But looking at these p-values, again, it's a relatively small influence of these covariates, and it's really about our strict multiple comparison cutoff that's going on here. Okay, so that's going on here. Okay, so, and again, no association with social jet lag like we predicted, although we're getting close here with the weekend delay and rise time, not quite making the cutoff after controlling for multiple comparisons. To make these a little more digestible, so going back to some of the more consistent stories here. So if we look at the binge alcohol use, starting with cross-sectional, we see that greater eveningness, so in this case, lower scores, we see this general trend was associated with more higher categories or more extreme binge drinking at baseline. Now, there's this weird little bump in the extreme category, but that cell was only a few participants, so probably not a reliable estimate. Now, more interesting than perhaps though is the longitudinal associations, and so here we see a very clear association, 1-year follow-up. And I see we've lost our labels for that too. That as evening and as weekend bedtime goes later, we see more extreme binge drinking a year later. And if we look at those odds ratios, most easily interpretable here, basically for every hour later people went to bed and the weekend at baseline, there was a 26% increased risk of being in a higher category of binge drinking. Marijuana use, basically the same story, so both cross-sectionally and longitudinally, greater eveningness or later weekend bedtimes were both associated with more likely having used marijuana, and putting into odds ratios, for every hour later they went to bed and smoking marijuana a year later. And again, that's after controlling for all the covariates, age, sex, parental SES, and for baseline substance use. So summarizing those findings then, we saw that sleep at baseline was associated with both cross-sectionally and prospective associations with alcohol and marijuana use. And the most consistent story was these timing variables. So variables that had tended to be overlooked in prior studies, but seem to be the most consistent ones here. Suggesting something we need to pay more attention to. Now, as I mentioned, one of the things that we thought was really important about the adolescent experience and the reason timing mattered was this social jet lag idea, this bouncing back and forth between weekdays and weekends, and our measure of substance use at baseline or the 1-year follow-up. So raising the questions is, why is late timing matter if it's not about the social jet lag? And we can come back to that. And then the final, in thinking about these results, that again, as I mentioned earlier on, there's this caveat that even at the 1-year follow-up in this sample, the prevalence of risky substance use remained low. So as we get into the later follow-ups, we'll be very interested in seeing how these effects change and perhaps strengthen as more and more of the sample has engaged in use. So then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms we think might be involved, and we've been particularly interested in how reward function might be affected in these situations. So I've talked about social jet lag and circadian misalignment, and we can define that as a mismatch between the timing of the behavioral sleep-wake schedule and that of the internal clock. And the most obvious examples of this are shift work and jet lag. But I think with adolescents, we have this interesting case where they're experiencing a kind of misalignment. That may be more subtle, certainly than working night shifts or traveling to Europe or farther, but it also tends to be more chronic. And so that more subtle circadian misalignment may end up having a greater impact. Now, again, we can measure the circadian alignment using the melatonin rhythm. So if we look at the relationship between the timing of the internal clock measured by melatonin and the sleep-wake schedule, we can actually get a quantification of the alignment and sleep onset. How does it change under misaligned conditions? And one of our first findings in this area was in a study done back at the University of Arizona in Dick Bootsen's lab. And here we were recruiting teens that were coming out of substance abuse treatment programs, and they were reporting problems with sleep. And the goal was substance use. And focusing just at the baseline data, we collected lost sleep data, and again, we were collecting their circadian information using this DILMO measure. And what we noticed was something interesting, and that is if we split them into those who had earlier timing and those with later timing, although the two groups differed by the circadian timing, their sleep timing was essentially the same. So they were both trying to accommodate that same sleep schedule. And so what really distinguished them then was the relationship between their circadian timing and their sleep timing, the alignment per se. And we call those quantification, the alignment per se. And we call those quantifications, those intervals between their circadian timing and their sleep timing, phase angles, and they're shown here with the A and B labels. And when we looked at those angles continuously, we found that those shorter phase angles that we saw in the late DILMO group were also associated with greater. Those with later timing were reporting more SUD symptoms, and then when we correlated it with this measure, that was where we found the strongest correlation, suggesting, again, there might be something important about misalignment with relation to risk for substance use. So going back to our alignment then, if it looks normally something like this in these late groups, that whole relationship shifted where there's this much smaller association between, or much shorter interval between the internal clock time and sleep timing, and And one way to think about that is that they are trying to go to sleep too early relative to what their internal clock was. Now it's great to have those biological measures of circadian phase, but they're not always available, they're not always practical, and so we've been using chronotypes in general as a model of misalignment. And so chronotype, or also called circadian preference, sometimes called morningness, eveningness, this tends to be a self-report measure, and we know that it spans a continuum from those that have early timing or LARCs to those who have later timing. They do correlate with the physiological measures. And very consistently, when we look across the literature, these evening types report more problems with sleep, more problems with depression, and more substance involvement. And there's also this emerging literature suggesting that they have altered reward function, and particularly for sensation and novelty seeking. So that leads us into the final part of my talk, where we are trying to understand the potential involvement of the reward system. And we can think about this in simple terms as wanting and liking processes, pursuing and consuming rewards that's relevant to a broad category of problems, not just substance use. And what we know from the animal literature is that the circadian system is heavily involved in this reward circuit. So the molecular clock is active in each of these regions, and the central clock influences the reward circuit. So we have this model then that having delayed sleep phase, have later, greater eveningness, later timing, in combination with early school start times is combining to cause some of these sleep and circadian problems, and that it may be problems with the part of that link then with substance involvement. So we've been looking at this with some neuroimaging studies, and just very quickly going through this. One study, we looked at social jet lag, where we looked at weekday-weekend differences in mid-sleep using actigraphy. In other words, weekday-weekend differences in mid-sleep using actigraphy. In other words, research-grade Fitbits. And we found that when we looked at that in association with how these healthy teams responded on an fMRI reward task, we found that the greater shifts, the more social jet lag, were associated with reduced response and reduced response in the ventral striatum in response to reward. We saw similar effects in another sample. These were all 20-year-old males, and completed that same task. And here we identified 21 evening types and 13 morning types, and found that those evening types also showed, in this case, a higher ventral striatal response, which we think may be a developmental effect. And importantly, in this study, we had measures of substance use, and we found that that same pattern of brain activity that the evening types were showing was associated with more alcohol use and greater alcohol dependence. So cross-sectional, that the problems with reward function are explaining why eveningness is associated with these alcohol problems. But again, cross-sectional data doesn't tell us which direction the arrow goes, and people always bring up the possibility that if you're engaging in substance use, that in itself could lead to later sleep timing and have effects on the clock. So we've been trying to address that in another study where we've been experimentally manipulating circadian misalignments, basically putting healthy teens on an aligned condition, and then the same teens also complete a misaligned condition where they have to go to bed 4 hours earlier and get up 4 hours earlier, so an exaggeration of the school schedule essentially. And preliminary data from that study suggests that this misalignment has effects both on the reward function task. We again see a lower MPFC response to reward, which could translate to impaired regulation of reward response. And then we see on this go, no-go task, a lower inferior frontal gyrus response to no-go, which again associated with gyrus response to no-go, which again associated with more impulsivity and has been linked in itself to later substance use. So just preliminary data, but suggesting that there may be something there. So going back to our conceptual model then, we have some preliminary evidence, again, that reward dysfunction may be part of this story, and the consistent story where lower MPFC response seems to be associated with these sleep and circadian disturbances. A little less clear about what's going on in the ventral striatum. So in terms of clinical implications, if we can show that these sleep and circadian disturbances have this effect on substance use risk, this identifies a new target area then for reducing risk. And one of the nice things in that case is that we have readily available effective sleep and circadian interventions. Both we have cognitive behavioral treatment for insomnia, which has been validated in adolescence. We can use bright light therapy to change the timing of their internal clock, which has also been shown to be effective in adolescents, particularly those with delayed sleep phase that are having particular trouble going to bed and getting up on time. Likewise, hypnotics and melatonin can be used to target sleep and the circadian clock, respectively. There may be advantages over these approaches over traditional drug and alcohol approaches. We've found, Bree and others have found that there seems to be less stigma attached to the sleep and circadian treatment. So they're more willing to entertain addressing their sleep and circadian problems, which then can have influence on the substance use problems in turn, and also can get them in the door. You form the relationship and get them and help them with sleep and circadian problems more directly, the substance use problems subsequently. But there are some challenges that I shouldn't neglect. One, there's always, especially with the teens, there's the motivational element, and telling them that they need to keep a more regular schedule on the weekends can be a tough sell. And so some of the work that's been done, especially with these teens with delayed sleep phase, is incorporating MI and CBT approaches, and as well as some parenting, targeting the parents to help with this. And then as a clinician and a researcher, I think my bias in this area is that, we're only going to get so far at the individual level, and that policy level changes, and particularly targeting later school start times, is going to be important to really move this forward. So in conclusion then, circadian characteristics, particularly chronotype and sleep timing, not only are associated with, but predict subsequent alcohol and marijuana use in adolescents and young adults, and that part of the story may be circadian misalignment and altered reward function. But there's a number of next steps that have to happen. So one is trying to understand better why eveningness is associated with addiction and across multiple studies, and not just using self-report measures, but using more objective sleep and circadian measures. There's some reason to believe that it may be that it may be that those that are have a greater eveningness are also just more risk-taking, and there may be more of a genetic link there rather than it being about the misalignment story. We also need more experimental designs, use physiological measures, and in particular, in something that we're beginning to advance sleep timing and extend sleep duration, so getting them on a more regular schedule and getting them more sleep during the week, does that reduce risk, both for substance use and mood disorders? So with that, I just want to acknowledge all my colleagues and funding sources. I want to give my contact information as well in case there were follow-up questions after the webinar. So I guess, do I turn it over to Carolina again at this point?
Just quickly on the contact information that was on the previous slide, I will be sending out the slides, and the webinar is being recorded, so you'll have access to that. So we have several questions from CADCA that we'd like to ask Dr. Hasler. He's touched on some of this already, but do you have any specific recommendations for community coalitions that are working to prevent substance abuse? Like, how can your findings be applied to youth substance use issues, particularly on the prevention side? You talked a lot about treatment and getting treatment for sleep issues as opposed to substance use issues, but how can we prevent youth from having substance issues in the first place?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously that's the key question here, and I think, in some ways the researchers, we're still at an early stage in being able to make this causal connection. So I always want to be cautious with my recommendations, but I think there is plenty of data now that good sleep is, and so both in terms of the proper timing and the proper duration. So I think we're on safe ground to saying that at the very least, assessing sleep in these teens will be important to identify those who may have both at times, even if it's not directly linked to their substance use. We know that it's related to their proper functioning overall. We know that in terms of mood and impulse control, et cetera. And so, I think, the brief measures that we included in this study point to some of the easy ways that you could assess sleep and just get a quick window into how these particular kids are doing, and one more place that you could try to address that should lead them to functioning better, and again, ostensibly have an influence on the risk for substance use. The risk for substance use.
So my second question is about school start times, and you talked a little bit about this, and it seems like you do recommend that coalitions should try, if possible, to work with their teens.
Right, and yeah, so do I think this is an effective way to prevent substance use? So I think that there's good reason to believe that. At this point, I'm not aware of any published data that has included substance use measures in these, in the various studies that have been done looking at school start times. They've shown it in relation to depression. They've shown it in terms of course, lots of sleep variables. They've shown it in terms of reducing car accidents. These are hard data to collect, and at least, unfortunately, at this point, I haven't seen any emerge specifically linking into substance use. All that said, I think, again, when we look at the literature overall, there's very good reason to believe they can only help in this area as well. And I don't want to can require or are involved. So one of my colleagues and co-authors on the paper, Peter Franzen's done a lot of work with schools in Pittsburgh, and the overarching message is that we know from the data that's currently available that it works, and that it's helpful. And we know that, out of the hundreds of school districts that have made the change, we're only aware of one that has ended up changing their school times back earlier, and that was a school district that tried to do it too quickly. But that it does require a lot of careful planning and forethought and getting all the stakeholders on board and involved along the way. So there's good reason that it's going to be better for the health. There's excellent data suggesting it's going to be a challenging process. And I'm hoping that, some of the work that we're doing will continue to demonstrate links to other problems like substance use and further incentivize making the change.
Before I ask this last question, I want to let everyone in the audience know that if you have any questions for Dr. Hasler, you can go ahead and type them in the chat box now. And my last question is about where the audience can learn more about your research and other research with sleep characteristics associated with youth substance use, and I assume that the slide before this has that information on it. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be probably my first suggestion, that, those are both places that you could get more information. I also have for those who're familiar with the ResearchGate web, another place that actually may be more current than our own website here and staying updated in terms of what we've been publishing in this area. It would also, the nature of the site will then also connect you to other people doing similar work.
I imagine coalition members might be interested in connecting with Peter Franzen, I think you mentioned, who's working with Pittsburgh School District to change the school start times. Mm-hmm. Is there any way they could get in touch?
Yeah, so the website that I put up for our Pittsburgh Sleep website, Peter is also a faculty member in our group, so his profile is on there and contact information would be there as well.
All right. Is there any further questions from the audience? All right. I don't see any questions that are typed in the chat box, so I will just say thank you, everyone, for... Oh, there is? Oh, I see someone typing. We'll go back. I'm waiting for you. Oh, just thank you. All right.
Just a thank you. Well, you're welcome. It was my pleasure.
And quickly, before people start leaving, I want to let you know that the next Research into Action webinar will be March 14th at 1 p.m., and it's going to be about marijuana. So it should be very fascinating.